Britain, poll reveals that 85% are worried about warming, the highest figure on record. They started taking a poll in 2005, which is exactly the time that I started working on climate change. So I've been working on climate change for about 14 years, and now the public are more concerned than ever. And interestingly, looking at the detail, which you can read on the way home, that number of people deeply concerned has jumped, I think, from 20% to 55% in the last year. So clearly we're seeing a big change in this area. So as I said, I'm Ben Coombs. I co-founded the Innovation and Sustainability Practice at PwC UK. I'm also a visiting senior fellow at London School of Economics at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment, and I'm an advisory board member of the All-Party Parliamentary Climate Change Group on Climate Change, which Caroline Lucas, the MP, heads up. So Eleni invited me here today to talk to you a bit about the work I've been doing at PwC on AI. But before I get into that, I thought I'd explain a bit about what I've done previously that led me into AI and why I work on AI predominantly now. So I'm an economist by background. When I left school, not many people were working in sort of high-tech AI. There were lots of people working in sort of other elements of tech, but I wanted to get into economics because I'm a macroeconomist by background. I'm a big sort of systems thinker, and macroeconomics seemed a good area to be in. I worked in that area after graduating from Edinburgh University for a couple of years, and then realised I didn't necessarily want to do growth and inflation forecasting and modelling for the next 30, 40 years, and decided to become an applied economist. So I went back to UCL and did a master's in environmental and resource economics, and learned a lot about resource use, the Fisher Rule, depletion of natural resources, as well as carbon budgets. Sorry, not carbon budgets because they haven't come in yet, but sort of carbon pricing and how we can manage and abate and mitigate climate change. From there I joined DEFRA, with the Department for Energy, Food and Rural Affairs, which at the time had climate change. I was there the day that DEC got set up, and I was part of the team that sort of helped recommend the Climate Change Act and the climate carbon budget. And I joined the Committee on Climate Change to help set up that whole framework that's still in existence 15 years on about the long-term targets. We did have an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions targets 2050, which is legally binding, which has now just been changed by Theresa May in the last few weeks in her government to a net zero target. So you've probably seen news around that and Extinction Rebellion arguing about whether that should be sooner rather than later. From there, I went and did some stints thinking about better growth and better climate, thinking about how can we get the economy to grow with climate change. So, for example, when Nicholas Stern, who's sort of the chair of the Grantham Institute at LSE, did his major report in 2006, he said that the costs of the damage were going to be 5 to 20% of global GDP, and the costs of action were going to be 1 to 5% of GDP, and that was essentially his argument for action. It was probably the biggest seminal piece on the economics of climate change. The issue with that, as we found from the years from 2006 to 2012, is that people don't necessarily want to pay that cost, even though the damage is 3 or 4 times the cost. So I worked with Felipe Calderon, who's the former Mexican president, and a group called the New Climate Economy with the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate, and we produced a report in 2014 about how you could actually grow the economy, you could get better growth and have a better climate, and that the two were, so it was a win-win in terms of actually moving to a lower resource, cleaner, quieter, better air quality environment could actually boost the economy rather than a cost, so you should be doing this anyway. And therefore we should move and direct resources to doing growth. That report was retweeted by Obama. It received a lot of attention in the media because it was one of the first reports to say that actually, hang on a second, this is good for us, we need to be doing this because it's going to actually boost growth. And Nick Stern's got a saying that the only 21st century growth story is a low carbon growth story. There is no high carbon growth story. So a few years after that, about 3 years ago, with sort of lack of action on climate change, and although we had the Paris Agreement, seeing sort of some backsliding with obviously the election of Trump and with things going on with Brexit in the UK, I suddenly realised that we were probably going to need more than policy, and we were going to need a massive technology response. So typically Europeans like to regulate, Americans like to innovate. I'm half American, my mum's from Oakland, California, which is in the Bay Area near Silicon Valley. And so I decided to sort of tilt my work more towards technology. And the main reason for that being is that we've got big non-linear problems as we enter the Anthropocene. man-made problems that we've created, and we're probably going to need big exponential solutions to solve for them. It's not going to be enough to go at the rate that we've been going previously. And just to explain that in mathematical terms, so if you think about an economy that has just to say 100 emissions, and when I joined the government in 2006, the target then, which was set in 2003, was to reduce emissions by 60%. So that target was to reduce by 40. So you'd have 40 left and you'd have reduced 60. So you can think of various actions that you could marginally and incrementally get to reduce that number from 100 to 40. As soon as you moved from 60% reduction to an 80% reduction, which we did in 2008, you halved residual emissions. So you went from 40%, so instead of 40 emissions, you're down to 20. And then when you go from 20, which we've just done, to net zero, it's another 100% reduction. So if you think about this from a sort of mathematical perspective, the scale of change that we've seen and the amount of reductions we need in emissions is huge. And it's looking at more like exponential changes in terms of those reductions that you need, in terms of to get the pace of change required to deliver those reductions. So I joined PwC 3 years ago, and I've set up a practice with a partner whom I work with called Selina Vaya, called Innovation and Sustainability, and we published a report at Davos in January 2017, and just a few months after I joined, called Innovation for the Earth, where we talk about how the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution, so there's sort of, we at PwC have an essential 8 technologies, but the core of those are really AI, blockchain, and the Internet of Things, which are often called the gearbox of the fourth industrial revolution. And we set out to say how those technologies could be harnessed and used to help climate change. So that report's still online. We have a webpage, www.pwc.co.uk/innovation for Earth, where all of our public reports are up there. That was the first one. Off the back of that, the World Economic Forum, so that was launched at Davos, the World Economic Forum said to us, come work with us on our new 4IR for the Earth program. So we worked with them for 2 years out of their new 4IR Centre in San Francisco, working with tech firms, startups, entrepreneurs, thinking about how can these technologies be harnessed for not just climate in that instance, oceans, life on land, cities and other areas that we looked into. And then we did a big report on AI specifically, which is probably where he picked up, called Harnessing AI for the Earth, and a big report on blockchain looking across the sort of global environmental challenges. Off the back of some of that work, Microsoft approached us and they talked to us about what they were doing on their AI for Earth program. So Microsoft have got a $50 million program, 5-year program called AI for Earth, which is on their website as well, which you can look up, where they are looking to tackle water, biodiversity, climate, and agriculture challenges. In climate, they mainly mean sort of natural climate problems, not sort of energy and transport, but more land use and land availability. So their program, we've helped them think about a bit about their strategy, a bit about their program, and then last year we started a project which we published this year called How AI Can Enable a Sustainable Future, where we looked at, and we think that this is a first of a kind study. So PwC 3 years ago did a size and the prize report about the economics of AI, how much can AI boost the global economy, and I'm going to forget the number now, but I think it's roughly around, we said it was about $30 trillion of economic value by 2030 if AI was deployed globally in the ways we set out in the sectors involved. And then we said, well, hang on a second here, so that's global AI. What if we harness AI and use it for the environment within agriculture, water, energy and transport? So we published a report this April which shows that through using those technologies and I'll talk a bit about the solution set in a minute, you could boost global GDP by 5.7 trillion by 2030, which is about 4%, and you could also reduce greenhouse gas emissions by about 4% at the same time. So there'd be a sort of decoupling of use. So what are the areas around climate that you can use AI, and what does AI really mean in that sort of climate sense? Well, for us, I suppose AI has 2 really powerful things: optimization and discovery. So in terms of discovery, the climate system is one of the most complex systems known to man. It's one of the reasons we have supercomputers. So the Met Office has a supercomputer in Exeter, which is interesting. So I went down there to talk to them. They actually moved their supercomputer, because it takes up as much energy as 120,000 households. They had to move it, literally, if you think of a grid, they had to move it 1 grid cell. So they built a business park in Exeter to house their supercomputer. So the Met Office has one of the largest data sets of climate information in the world, which is publicly available, so if anyone wants to go on, you can find they have all of their information. So that's one data set that it might be worth thinking about in terms of your sort of hack over the next few weeks. And there's a guy there called Alberto Arabas who runs an informatics lab, who's doing a lot of interesting work around AI and climate. And so the discovery process can often take years to really discover things, and with machine learning, deep learning and reinforcement learning, you can really speed up that process. And that's really, really helpful for understanding what's working and what's not working. And with the complex systems, that's going to be really valuable over the next 5 to 10 years of working out how the climate is actually changing. You may be wondering why, well I certainly was, why do we suddenly see the scientists getting more concerned about climate change now when they made these predictions 10, 15 years ago? And the answer is because everyone works in silos. So the people who were working on the ice melt were working sort of in economics called ceteris paribus, that everything else in the world remains the same and only this one thing changes. The trouble is, as soon as you institute sort of complex systems change, you get feedback loops. And so what we're starting to see now with the climate is those feedback loops interact. And that's why you often see scientists on the news saying this Greenland sheet wasn't supposed to, erode or melt for, another 30, 50 years. Because what was happening is the sea level people, the peat bog people, were all working separately, saying, well, the world stays the same, and if we change this one variable, this is what happens. So, but then what we're starting to see is integrative climate modelling is starting to pull that together, but that is taking time. Another area where AI will really help. So I think for me, in terms of climate, which is the main topic I've been asked to talk about, I think there are three. Oh, sorry, that was the discovery, and then the optimization is optimizing systems and thinking about how can you reduce losses and find optimal systems. So for me, within climate, there's really two areas where that's can really help. Energy networks. So the national grid, as we've seen from the blackouts, is starting to use AI to think about how to optimize those systems. With DeepMind, part of Alphabet, and then there's also sort of transport systems and transport networks and how you manage the flow. We're already seeing that obviously with Google Maps and things, but how do you integrate that into a system that makes things a lot more efficient? And also how do you change behaviour, sort of an economics through nudge, how do you change behaviour to persuade people to use different forms of transport through showing them that these forms of transport actually work. So I think those are the two areas. Within the sort of themes then, I think the areas that are really sort of ripe for change are the sort of network systems, so either water, energy, transport, where you can think about how can AI really optimize those systems in a way that is much more efficient for the people working, and how can we change? And the one thing I would say about both machine and deep learning, you probably know this story about AlphaGo and AlphaGo Zero, people nodding. But just that idea that AlphaGo Zero, you actually set the parameters of optimization and it achieved that, whereas AlphaGo you just gave it through machine learning just 1,000 or 100,000 gains for it to work it out for itself. So I think if we can get systems that are we set the parameters that we want to optimize, AI can really help achieve those goals in ways that we may not even think about. The other really big area that I spend a lot of time thinking about working on is computer image analytics and satellite-based AI. There are lots of new companies being set up. Planet's probably the most prominent one that's working with sort of Google. And thinking about how we can monitor species, monitor resources. So the great thing we've now got is you can almost monitor everything on the planet 24/7. And for example, AI is starting to be used to track deforestation. And the great thing about that is through satellite imagery, you can actually tell when the tracks are being built to get to the forest, which gives you the time to get the law in place to stop the logging. So you don't go up when they've locked half the forest and say, we don't need to be doing this. You see them like hacking away to build the track. You say, hang on, we know you're building that track to deforest there. We're going to go get the lawyers involved and stop that. So that's happening already. We've also already got people in Wildbook and others monitoring species, so being able to track species using AI and seeing where poachers are. We've got people tracking boats through Global Fishing Watch, Global Forest Watch. So there are these massive amounts of information, data sets being collected. I think there's a really good article which I put on my LinkedIn about what does this all mean about surveillance. And I think there are some similar questions about people as there are about resources, and who owns the resources, who owns the profits of the resources, who is the product, what are the incentive structures for companies versus governments versus startups in this space. So I think that's going to be an interesting area to watch. So I think we've seen that area about data privacy, about people and people's faces and people's privacy. I think we're also going to start to see that about the environment and natural resources and who owns those. In the same way that there are big issues about who owns oil, who has the economic rent of oil. I don't think data's in the oil, but I'm just trying to give that analogy of resource information. So I think that set of, and then the computer image is another big area. And then I think there's a big area around the sort of the climate modelling and understanding how the climate operates and what we can feed into the solution set for climate. So I'm not really a big fan of geoengineering, but certainly looking at solutions to air capture. Lots of people are doing some very clever things of turning CO2 into cement, and cement that sucks CO2 as it's made, and all of these sorts of things. So I think there are ways for the discovery process with using AI to help us manage greenhouse gas emissions. And then the fourth area I think is probably around disaster resilience and using, well, I might go for a fifth area as well. So just trying to give you lots of different ideas, the sort of disaster resilience. So I know IBM are working in, I think it's Haiti or certain one of the Caribbean islands, about, and I think it's really clever. So with blockchain and AI, they're trying to get a disaster network system where if a disaster happens, everyone is notified through machine learning, through their communication, not just there's something happening, but also through GPS, where should you head? Should you head inland? Should you head to the port? Should you head this way? So they're trying to work on a system which tells people where to head when there's a disaster, which is going to be incredibly helpful. They're also using blockchain for people to, and smart contracts for people to bid on tents, food, water, on what they can provide in certain areas of the island or get to the island within a certain amount of time. And then what they can do is they can link the AI with the blockchain to say, we need tents in this area because that's where the crisis is, and it can close out the contracts without speaking to anyone because people have bid at a certain price. And so you can almost have an automated disaster response system that takes away emotion, gets people in the right places, and that can rely on AI and blockchain. And there are various, you can think of various instances where that can be helpful with extreme weather, with transport, when transport goes down. And then the other example I just wanted to give was about, Lenny mentioned about provenance and tracking food. And I think using AI and blockchain together in that area is another big area we're starting to see where people are using smart contracts to track the movement of goods, and then using AI to optimize delivery, optimize routing systems. And so the reason I mentioned also AI and blockchain is quite often, you don't just use AI on its own. It's the electricity of the 4IR, as people talk about, but it's not necessarily, again with electricity in the second industrial revolution, you didn't just use electricity on your own, you used electricity to do light bulbs, to do this, to do that, to do the other, and you combined it with the other technologies of that industrial revolution to give you the really big movements forward. For example, it'd be very difficult to make cars if you didn't have electric light to have a factory to work in, for example. Anyway, I think that's probably about it. I don't know how many, I've probably overrun.
No, it's fine. Does anyone have any questions? That was very, very helpful, and if you don't mind, we'll record you just because we want to
sure, that's fine.
But we have a few teams here who are tackling climate change, and I have a feeling that some of them might pivot again, having just heard you speak. I don't mind. So, Michael, you want to kick off with a question?
Yeah.
Yes.
In London particularly, what top three, I can't word this. What are the top three contributors to climate change, do you think?
That's a good question. Okay, I don't know for London in particular, but it's usually a combination of transport, energy use, and land use. So in terms of, in London it would be very heavily, probably in cities it's more transport and energy than land use, because really in land use it's agriculture and it's methane and so it's thinking about how do we change our transport systems and how do we change our energy systems. So with transport systems, the one thing I'm very hopeful about is electric vehicles, and the reason is not just because of climate change, but because of noise and air quality. And I think if we will get to a stage in the next 10, 15 years where people will say you cannot drive a combustion engine into the middle of the city, in the same way that you look over at the Battersea Power Station, you think where that was, right nearly in the centre of the city, and you think you can't have a coal-fired power station in the centre of the city anymore, because everyone will go, you just can't do that. And it's going to be the same with combustion engines in the city. So I doubt by, I think the official line is 2040, but I doubt by 2030 whether you're going to see small-scale combustion engine vehicles in cities, because I just think everyone's going to have enough of the noise and the air pollution. And there's also the climate element, which is overlays that.
So I think the next question Michael wanted to ask you was, what would it take to convert those who don't ride bikes into riding bikes?
Yeah.
To eliminate cars completely?
So I think there's a lot of work on this. I think safety is the key issue. I think, and I see that, I think I don't know whether it's in the Netherlands or Denmark, I've just been on holiday, so I just caught various things, reading half articles by the pool, but there's somewhere there where they've invested heavily in infrastructure. They're spending another like 10 billion euros, because what they've realised is they need to make the network as safe as possible, and it needs to be cycling only. So they're building a lot of overways, underways, they're building things. And I think that for me is the key. If cycling is safe, then I think people will use it. Because actually a bike's not very expensive. You can subsidise it, or you can give, you can always give bikes, so it's 200 quid in thing. It's not a huge amount from the government to just provide bikes. But it's the safety and the infrastructure around that. And it's being able to get from point A to point B, and not just having a super highway that's halfway. You're like, well, what about the 20 minutes to get to the super highway and the 20 minutes home? And that also comes into vehicle use, of when lorries can use the city. I mean, I would not be surprised if we get to a stage where deliveries can only happen between 10 at night and 6 in the morning. And you basically open up your transport infrastructure at night, and then during the day you say, well, this is for people. So, like, although people talk about pedestrianisation, you still need to get stuff to stores, but can you do that in a different way? Go for it.
This is what you do now, create money for PwC.
Good question. I get asked that question a lot. So half of what I do is what I would call helping with us as a brand in terms of our purpose, and I spend a lot of time sort of helping the firm think about these issues. So I have a role that is external, like working with the Wellington Forum, us partnering with these big initiatives, and then half of my work is commercial work, like with Microsoft or with others who pay for projects. I think what we're seeing is that people are increasingly in large-scale transformation projects, in other digital projects, are wanting to have that sustainability element. So our aim is really to be there within the design process of what people do. We're not there yet, but that is the sort of firm's aim, is to have a mixture of sort of external-facing and internal-facing with our clients. But certainly our clients are asking more and more about sustainability, and we're seeing that it is a differentiator in the work that we do. But we understand about how, particularly these emerging technologies, can help solve those types of problems. And we are working with everyone from the sort of NGOs to the big oil companies too. And that's really fascinating to see, because if you think about those numbers I gave you, the reason I set out those numbers, if you're going from 100 to 60, if you're going from 100 to 40, reducing by 60, there's a lot of people you can avoid and not talk to, and just say, well, look, we can get to 60, so don't worry about this 40. And the reason it's so important when you go to net zero is it's everyone. Everyone's got to be involved. It's the whole economy, it's the whole society. So you can't just say, well, we're going to ignore the manufacturing sector or the industry sector or civil society or all the oil and gas industry. Everyone's got to work together to achieve those aims. And that's why it's a very exciting time to be in climate. I think it's the first time I think everyone's realised, okay, this isn't an incremental story, this is a transformational story.
How has your background in economics helped you with your career now?
Really good question. So when I joined sort of working in tech, I was a bit nervous, and one of the reasons I want to come to talk to you today is because I think tech for me is about everything, in the same way like saying I work in policy. Well, you could work in tech policy, you could work in trade policy, and I think for me economics is a bit like that as well, where a lot of the things we have discussions about can be like, so I was at Microsoft and we were talking about energy and the work we were doing in this project, and suddenly their chief environmental officer, Lucas Jock, is one of the smartest guys I've ever met. It was just like, well, what about Jevons paradox, which is an economic concept that however much we improve energy efficiency, we still use more energy throughout history. And so So there are lots of economic concepts, opportunity cost, incentive structures, behavioural change that come into this, as well as my more sort of formal training in sort of impact assessment and setting up policy and regulation and how that all works. And what's really been interesting is working with people who have worked in technology and thinking about those broader enabling environments and what makes things work. And at the end of the day, we're all dealing with people. And although we're dealing with machines, we're dealing with machines that we need to understand as people. And I think that that's where the sort of human element comes in. And economics is ecos nomos, is home management. And I think bringing that element up actually is, I found it more interesting than I thought I would. I thought I'd be dropping a lot more economics, but I use my economics a lot. And I think actually what we're going to realise is that within a lot of these areas, we are going to need a broad section of society to be involved. Philosophers, ethicists, lawyers, politicians, you know, we need everyone to be involved because we're designing a different world for ourselves. And in that respect, we need all stakeholders, because what we don't want is necessarily a world designed by a group of people in Palo Alto, 27-year-old males, designing what the world wants to look like, because that won't necessarily reflect the broad society and what an older population needs. So.
You talked about turning carbon dioxide into cement. Is that currently a commercially available thing, or is it only for